Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised that Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
You are listening to Yeah, Nah, Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And we're joined this week by Seyward Darby, the author of Sisters in Hate, American Women on the Front Line of White Nationalism. Thanks for joining us, Seyward.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I guess just to begin with, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what was the impetus for writing this book?
So I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for, my whole adult life and even a little before that, working in school at a paper. And I've always been really interested in politics and culture. And primarily my job is actually as a magazine editor, but I freelance from time to time on meaty projects that I am really interested in. And after Trump's election in 2016, I, like a great many people, after I picked myself up off the floor in despair, I was really interested in the chatter that had surrounded the so-called alt-right before and during election season. And I was struck by the fact that a lot of the coverage, most of the coverage, described the alt-right as a bunch of angry white men. And that didn't really square with the fact that it appeared as though a majority of white women, ultimately the poll showed it was a plurality of white women, had voted for Trump. And I thought, it just doesn't make sense to me that this newest iteration of white nationalism would be entirely made up of men. Why, who are the women? Why are the women not being quoted? And so the impetus really was just that curiosity. And so in December 2016, I went looking for the women of white nationalism. And I guess I've been on the hunt ever since.
Yeah, you certainly found some. The book is sort of a history of white nationalism and women's involvement in it, but it's framed around these three specific women. How did you go about finding them and how did you get them to talk to you?
Yeah, so I spoke to a number of women, in that late 2016 into early 2017 period, and I found them on the internet, and they were all women who had profiles in some way. So, they had YouTube channels or they had very active Twitter feeds or blogs. And I had a conversation. I was working on a magazine article that ultimately, turned into the book. But I spoke with my magazine editor at the time about the best way to approach these women. And, I could have gone undercover, which is certainly one way of doing this kind of journalism. But I ultimately decided that if I was honest with them about who I was and what I believed and how, I was never going to come around to their worldview, I was just going to feel better about the way that I was approaching the project. And so there was a risk there insofar as, when I said I'm a progressive and a feminist and, I don't believe the things that you believe. There were certainly some women who were not interested in talking to me at all, but then there were some that were. And in one case, one of the women who went on to be one of the main subjects of the book, Lana Lockteff, who runs Red Ice, a white nationalist platform, she was helpful in connecting me with a couple of other women. And then ultimately, as I expanded the magazine article into a book, because as you said, it's a bit more of a history than the magazine article was, because it focused very, very specifically on the alt-right. I was able to, reach out to women who had been involved in this space for a longer period of time or at different periods in time. And again, that was just a lot of online research, digging through old articles by the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, but then also, more local newspapers in cities where there are known to be, pretty active white nationalist cells, and identifying women who, whose names were available. And also the organization Life After Hate, which helps people leave white nationalism and ultimately not just leave groups, but then, leave the ideology behind. That was also a source of subjects because they had a couple of women who were willing to tell me their stories.
So you're quite upfront about the prospect of converting you. Did any of them still try?
No. I mean, not in a evangelical way, for lack of a better word. I think that what's sneaky about the way that women in particular in this space work is that they won't necessarily come right out and say, I'm going to convince you that, my way of thinking is the right way. They more so want to, seem very friendly, seem very relatable. And I think the idea is like, well, if they see that I'm not such a bad person, even if I don't agree with their worldview, maybe I'll start to treat it as on equal footing with my worldview, just a different way of seeing the world, which I was, of course, not going to do. But no, at no point did anybody attempt to say, I'm right, you're wrong, and like let me tell you why, and here's why you should come around. I also was not interested in arguing with them. That was the one rule I gave myself when I started doing these interviews, because I recognized that arguing with them was not going to get anywhere, because they come to the table with different terms, right? The way that they define certain words, or the way that they see history is just so radically different than the way I define terms or see history, that if you start to argue with them, you're basically, screaming at a wall. And so I worked really hard in my interviews to kind of keep a straight face and just ask as many questions as I could, recognizing that, I could bring my criticism to bear in the writing. And I think that also they seek to convert by arguing and making points. And I kind of shied away from doing that.
So you've noted the fact that there's something seemingly incongruous with women's participation in white nationalist politics. Also that in their public performances, many tried to present a more innocuous or less threatening image of this movement. And yet the book's titled Sisters in Hate. So I'm wondering if you could explain what you mean by hate in this context, why you regard it as being a somewhat complex phenomenon, and how it relates to white nationalist politics.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, the most illuminating part of this entire process for me, just as a human being, was reconsidering what I think of when I think of hate. And this is based a lot on the work of one sociologist in particular. Her name's Kathleen Blee. She's at the University of Pittsburgh, and she's been studying organized racism and hate in America for decades. And there are not a lot of people who've been doing that. She's a really impressive scholar. And there are others who certainly, agree with her, but she basically says hate is, if you think of hate strictly as disdain for someone or something, you're missing the dimensions in which hate functions as a social bond, a way of creating a network, a way of feeling like someone has defined their place in the world and, has knowledge and, a way of a narrative that they are able to tell themselves about why the world is the way that they perceive it to be. And that to me was so incredibly helpful to understanding the nature of white nationalism, because if you just assume that the people who get involved in that space are, more racist than the average person, or, are particularly unwell mentally or something along those lines, you're missing the fact that there are people who get into the space without having racist views that are so much worse, so much more intense than the average American, white American, I should say, that they often are looking for something else, whether it's power or community or a sense of value or whatever it may be. And they get into this space on that basis. That's what they're looking for. And then they ultimately start to profess the beliefs, use the rhetoric, engage in violent behavior in some cases, or certainly engage in racist behavior. And that can be learned and performed over time. And that's not to minimize the things that they say and the things that they do, but rather it's to recognize that it's a more complex process than I think we tend to assume that makes someone into an extremist. And I think a really, I'm not from Australia, I have not spent any time there, and I don't, know the politics there terribly well. But, in the United States, I think one thing that's key to remember, and I make this point in the book, is that the things that white nationalists believe are not so radically different, really, than mainstream racism and white supremacy. They are just, saying things out loud that other people feel uncomfortable saying. They are, maybe amplifying or augmenting, exaggerating, but what they're saying is not it's not as though it's something people haven't heard before. And I think that's another important thing to remember when people are getting involved in white nationalism. Maybe they're there because of the network it provides, but then the things that people are telling them are legitimate ways of seeing the world and moving through the world are things that maybe they feel deep down, I've always felt that way. And now I'm just allowed to express it. Now I'm just allowed to do it. So that's a very roundabout way of saying that, hate, certainly hate as a way of thinking is a way of feeling superior. It's a way of assuming that people who do not look like you are lesser than you. But then beyond that, hate is also a social phenomenon. It's something that happens between people. And that's just, to me, the most important kernel of knowledge that I, acquired in working on this book.
Something I found really interesting throughout the book was the ways that women were sort of fundamental to a lot of racist and fascist movements. Could you speak a little about some of the surprising things you found out about how women were involved in these movements?
Definitely. I mean, the thing that I found so surprising was just periods of history that I thought I knew, whether, I'm from the South in the United States and have a pretty good understanding of the history there. And, I've studied the history of genocide and have read a lot about World War II and, feeling like I had a pretty good sense of certain periods of history. And then in the course of working on this book, realizing the ways that women have been written out of those periods of history, by which I mean certainly women are constantly written out of history in a positive sense, with regard to contributions to science, to politics, to any number of things. But in this case, they've been written out of the history of how they've contributed to fascism and hate. And I think there's a sexism in play there because there was a quote that I heard someone say, and I've never then been able to find who said it, but essentially this idea that, women are so often seen as society's better angels. And that's a form of sexism, right? Assuming that women are on a pedestal, that they are more innocent, they're pure, they're, any number of things. And so when you look back at periods in history where fascism has come to bear or white nationalism has been particularly powerful, there's this idea that, well, women wouldn't do that. They wouldn't engage in that. They're better than that. Totally false. And there are some really wonderful books from the last, mostly from feminist historians, showing the ways that women were more deeply integral and active, not just passive, not just present, not just not lifting a finger to help, but actually actively involved in regimes ranging from slaveholding in the United States to the Klan in the early 1900s to Nazi Germany. And I think that women today who are involved in the space know the fact that women in the past have been written out. And so they're able to present a front of, well, of course I'm not a Nazi. I'm just a nice mom. I'm just a nice wife. I just want to have a nice, comfortable life. And, I'm nothing like those people from the past. And then people look to the past and they mostly see men. And so they're like, well, okay, I guess maybe you're not like that. And so, there's a part of all of this that I hope was bringing together kind of underappreciated and misunderstood thread of history, which is, women's contributions to fascism and to hate, and trying to put the lie to the fact that women today who are involved in white nationalism are really any different than those women. And also really interrogating the idea that women should be able to inhabit this space of, being society's better angels, because that is benevolent sexism. It's almost like, I don't know, a form of it that I'd never really thought about before working on this book, but suddenly kind of floodgates are open. And now, I can look back at history and wonder, well, how did women play a role in any number of oppressive regimes worldwide and have just been sort of, forgotten or written out over time?
Apart from, I guess, a commitment to thorough analysis and historical accuracy, why do you think it's dangerous to overlook the role of women in white nationalist and far-right politics? And what problems or challenges do you think this presents to a feminist understanding of society and of these movements?
Yeah, I think that if we ignore the roles that women play or assume, and this is something I should have said in answer to the last question as well, the far right is a hyper-misogynistic space and deeply anti-feminist. And so I think that there's also a sense among a certain set of men and women who, say, well, why would a woman ever be involved in that when it's so obviously against her interests. But these women have ultimately defined their interests in a different way than, I would ever define my interests as a woman, or frankly, their interests as a woman. And so I think, it's important to recognize that, yes, this is a hyper misogynistic space, but also there are women who are happy with that. And, what we say is sexism, what is sexism, they define as just normal, natural, the way things are supposed to be. But I think that we risk in ignoring the roles that women have played or diminishing them. I think we risk recognizing, I guess the best way to think about it is sort of in like a hard power, soft power dichotomy. So I studied international relations in grad school. So men are often the leaders of organizations. They're the ones with, traditional political cachet. They are more often than women the violent actors on the far right. But women play this very important role as, the glue that holds communities together. But they also are bridges to the more mainstream. People who can say at a parent-teacher association meeting, at a neighborhood association meeting, at a gathering of people interested in a particular issue, like, protecting the environment or, questioning the efficacy of a coronavirus vaccine or something along those lines. Women, that's where they assert their power as recruiters, as strategists. And I think that if we don't pay attention to that, if we think of that as like somehow less important activism wise than people who perpetrate violence on, in the name of white nationalism, or people who happen to be the president of some group, we're missing the more day-to-day and frankly pernicious ways that white nationalism can take hold in someone's mind or in a community. And so appreciating the role or understanding the role that women play in this space is also to really dig into the space and to realize the layers upon layers that exist, and that it's not just who holds a title or who's been convicted of a criminal act, which is not to say that criminal acts are not really important and things that we should be going after as a society, but there are more mundane, frankly, ways that white nationalism can spread, and women are and have been for a long time very important activists in that way.
You're listening to Yeah Nah Passaran on 3CR, 8:55 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We're currently talking to Seyward Darby, the author of Sisters in Hate. The three women you speak to all come to white nationalism through very unique sort of pathways. But did you find commonalities in their journeys?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent. I mean, there was Kathleen Blee, the sociologist I mentioned earlier. She had a wonderful quote, not wonderful, but just succinct, I should say, to the point and saying so much in the New York Times back in the 90s, where someone asked her, is there a profile of the type of person who gets into white nationalism? And she said, that would be comforting, which I think it would be, because then you could map it and you could predict things better. I think the commonality really, in a general sense, is that they're all seekers in some way. They're people who are looking for something, whose need for something has become outsized in comparison to other needs. So again, whether we're talking about community, we're talking about power, we're talking about just a sense of faith in something, a sense of allegiance to something. They are people who really, really want something. And this is the place in which they find it. I also think that they tend to be people for whom changing their minds is a pretty normal thing. And it's interesting because there's a paradox there, because on the one hand, they'll say, I radically changed the way that I saw the world. I, went from being more of a centrist or a liberal or whatever to being a true, a strong believer in white nationalism and needing to protect the white race. But again, I think that underneath that is the fact that the baseline of what mainstream politics, particularly in the United States, it's a white supremacist system, it's a racist system, and they are, it's not such a 180, it's not like they're turning from one side to the other. It's more that one side, the way that they were looking before, possessed certain degrees of white supremacist beliefs, of a racist way of seeing the world, and then this again, augments it, exaggerates it. And so I think that's the other thing is there are people who are prone to changing their mind, but also like want to have their mind changed. And so in this case, they are very susceptible to being told, this is a radical way of seeing the world. This is an avant-garde, not avant-garde, but like you're on the vanguard of like, the political future or whatever it may be. When in fact, everything that they are saying and doing, maybe the rhetoric's a little bit different, but it's the same old America is a white country. It was just things that the whole country was founded upon. So yeah, they're seekers. They're people who like the idea of finding truth. And beyond that, it's really hard to find commonalities. All three of the women that I profile did not get into the movement because of a man. They didn't get into it because they had a husband or a boyfriend or a love interest, which I think is another sort of sexist assumption about the space that, if a woman is in it, it's because of a man. They came to it independently and, they had different educational backgrounds. They had different family backgrounds. And none of them were from the South. Well, one of them kind of was. She was born there, but she wasn't raised there. And so immediately everything gets a bit messy because the commonalities fall away or, they sort of only exist in the realm of the general in terms of, that they're seekers. So it's, I don't mean to be a pessimist, but I sort of am a pessimist in that, I think that there are a lot of people who are susceptible to this way of seeing the world and this way of thinking.
Well, it's good that they passed the Bechdel test.
I guess. Looking for silver linings constantly in this space and rarely finding any.
Exactly. I can't help but think of, and I saw you mention this on Twitter the other day when you talk about those people who are susceptible, the wellness industry, and that sort of space on social media. Those people seem very susceptible to these arguments.
Absolutely. And if you think about, what is wellness all about? It's about taking care of oneself, taking care of one's immediate circumstance. There's also a degree of interest in purity, of things that are not tainted, things that are not toxic, sort of cleansing your environment. And frankly, that's white nationalism is an argument for that. It's eugenics in its worst form. But even when it's not that, even when it's, I don't want certain people living in my neighborhood, or by which I mean, people who are not white, or any number of other ways of thinking about what a society should look like, it's just a racial and political manifestation of this obsession with purity and health. And so it's frankly not surprising that I think it's also a self-interested thing. And this is, I certainly want to take care of myself, and I encourage people to take care of themselves. And I don't mean to suggest that turning inward and thinking about how to be a happier person or a healthier person is a bad thing. But I think that this space also appeals to a particular narcissism. White nationalism does. This idea that the most important thing is you and yours. The most important thing is taking care of your own. And this, real rejection of a wider sense of community, and also the willingness to be uncomfortable. Because I think so often, the wellness and self-care industry is all about, well, how can you feel more centered? How can you feel less threatened? How can you feel less anxious? And again, white nationalism is also all about how can you be all of those things. It's just in the sense of like, how can you feel safer in your neighborhood? How can you feel safer in your country? And there's just a particular narrowing of the idea of what it means to be a human being, frankly, but also, just a citizen of your community, of your country, and being willing to find yourself uncomfortable sometimes and working through that and being a better person, being a bigger person. We all have prejudices, and those are just something you have to work through. And white nationalism says, no, don't work through it. Don't work through it. And I think that self-care in like an extreme sense, the wellness industry in an extreme sense, can promote something similar. This idea that like, well, if it makes you uncomfortable, don't do it. If it makes you uncomfortable, don't go there. Like, that's not healthy for you. And I think that, that's completely at odds with anti-racist work and a lot of social justice work.
I guess just to finish, in the book, you note that some of the women were not especially happy that you were writing a book about them. Now that the book is out, have they read it, and what has their response been?
If they have read it, which frankly I would be a bit surprised if they have not said so. Lana Lockteff, very shortly after the book came out, she and her husband on Red Ice, which is, still a very widely watched platform on the far right, they recorded a video where, they said I was a stalker and was a slanderer and all these different things, which, I mean, if asking questions and telling the truth is stalking, I don't know what to say. That's, journalism at its best. So they've certainly, I think that so far they've been sort of dismissive. Like, this is just garbage. This is anti-white drivel. And if they've read it and have more specific things that they disagree with or things they want to say, they have not said them yet. There's still time, obviously. But then I read some chatter on like the wider far right internet that people who even maybe have read the book, their take is the same. Like, they go into it with a preconceived idea of what they're going to think about it. And I'm just a liberal, feminist, idiot, any number of things in their vocabulary that, they like to think of me as. So cat lady is a frequent, I'm just a cat lady, which I do. I have a cat. I love my cat, but I also have a dog. I love my dog. So yeah, I don't want to jinx it, but thus far, the reception has been mostly positive and then predictable, I guess I would say, on the far right.
Well, thanks very much for joining us, Seyward. The book is called Sisters in Hate. You can get it wherever you get your books in this pandemic age. Maybe a little bonus question for the podcast. Did you want to ask about the anarcho-syndicalism?
I could. I did have a couple more questions, but just in relation to that, Seyward, I think it was, is it Ayla?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah. At some point on her journey, in her first few steps, she described herself as an anarcho-syndicalist. And I guess with maybe some of the others as well, Lana, there's been various ideological identifications that these women have adopted at various points before arriving at white nationalism. Mm-hmm. And there also seems to be quite as you've, I think, written in the book, this desire to obtain meaning and significance, mm-hmm. which isn't available to them through normal channels. So to what extent do you think these women, in terms of their journey, could easily have ended up, somewhere else, I suppose? And what are the factors? Are there particular factors that mean that these white women in 21st century America or Australia do find themselves involved in white nationalist and far-right politics?
Yeah, I think that's, such an important question, because if you're a seeker, right, and you're just a person who purely is interested in finding, the next thing that, identifies you or you feel that you identify with or whatever, that could cross the gamut, right? And I think that what's interesting about these women is that at the end of the day, they were ultimately concerned about maintaining their status as white women in a society where white people are at the top of the hierarchy. So, might they have wound up, I don't know, more so on the far left? Might they have identified as socialist or something along those lines? I mean, Ayla did to a certain extent in her younger life, back in the, 2000 to 2007, 8 period, I guess. But ultimately, she, if you read, she was a very prolific blogger at the time. And again, there's this desire to be seen and heard and, a status to preserve as a white woman, as a white mother. And I think that that's where, women who want to have meaning, who want to feel like they're on the front lines of something, who want to feel, like they're really making an impact and, I don't know, on the cutting edge of something, whatever that, whatever the way it is that they're thinking about it. They also, beneath that, want to maintain their status. And so, they have no desire, again, to be uncomfortable, to feel like someone else gaining rights, someone else, finally being treated equally under the law means that, they lose something, which of course it doesn't, but that's ultimately the thing that undergirds it. So I don't know. I mean, yes, I guess they all could have wound up in some kind of different place, but I think at the end of the day, beneath all of this, I'm looking to the future. I'm thinking of the next thing. What is my new identity? There was a very retrograde sort of pull toward an old way of existing in America, frankly, the oldest way of being at the top of the hierarchy.
I just thought I'd ask about the anarcho-syndicalists, because our audience is probably half international relations students, so they got their one before, and the other half would be anarcho-syndicalists.
So in terms of the role that these women play in this movement, and I'm not sure that we've discussed it previously in the interview, but there's this tremendous esteem given to the role of being a mother. And in this context, the critical role that white women play in the reproduction of the white race. So I guess my question is, how is motherhood utilised in this context, and why is it accorded such importance, and how does that play out in these case studies?
Yeah, I mean, motherhood is, essential. Frankly, if your entire project is about preserving your people, so to speak, you need to make more people. So motherhood is essential. And what we've seen over time from, again, the Klan in the early 20th century, especially the Nazis who gave out medals to women, depending on how many children they'd had, to today, and the sort of valorization of having white children, raising white children, building a future that protects their interests, which means remaining at the top of the social hierarchy. Motherhood is, without it, there is no movement. Without it, there is nothing other than rhetoric, frankly. And I think that there's something there about ease. There's something there about a white woman who's looking for meaning, who's looking for power, who's looking for value, a sense of, having value, who's being told you have all of those things simply by virtue of who you are, what your biology is, what your aesthetics are, and being told that you're special and you matter because of that. And so I think that motherhood, just from a symbolic standpoint, is so important, and it's a huge part of propaganda and the visuals pertaining to the far right. But then I also think that from the standpoint of recruitment and from the standpoint of sort of acclimating people to the movement, women are told that they don't really have to do very much, frankly. They don't have to think too hard. They don't have to even actively do anything if they don't want to, politically speaking. But then as a wife, as a mother, you are a keeper, not just of your family, you are a keeper of the race. You are a keeper of the nation. Like, you are a warrior, essentially, by doing all of those things. And so there's a function where there's the symbolism of it, and this is the thing that we're fighting for. And so, you put the mother on the pedestal, and whoever is an actor in this space, whether they're committing violence or whether they're seeking political power or whatever it may be, that's what they're fighting for. That's the symbol. But then women themselves become activists as mothers. And I think, too, motherhood is something that they, again, can bond with other women in society over. And in the United States, again, I don't know a ton about Australia, and forgive me for that, but in the United States, mothers we celebrate mothers, we love mothers, but then we actually treat mothers really terribly. We have no great maternal leave. We don't take care health-wise of mothers and children in the way that we should. And so here's a space where all of these things that you, as a woman who's interested in being a wife and being a mother, have felt very confused by or victimized by, depending on who you are and what the policies you're facing are, or the circumstances you're facing are. And here you're being told this is celebrated. And I think that that's something that they can find very alluring. And then they can find common ground with other women who feel similarly, but maybe haven't figured out what their worldview is yet, or are trying to decide how they want to raise their children. And this is where sort of the soft power of white nationalism comes into play, is, women communicating with other women about being mothers, being wives, being women, frankly. And that's so important and so overlooked when we talk about the far right.
One of the things I thought was interesting in the case of these women in particular, but other women involved in the movement, is the kind of somewhat unresolved tension between being esteemed for playing the role of the mother and housekeeper, and having the ostensibly private domain be they're the most important actor in that, in the household. At the same time, having a very public presence as propagandists, and having to produce propaganda and become personalities, I suppose. And I wondered, what's been the role of the internet and technology in particular in facilitating this kind of expression, where on the one hand they're very committed to maintaining the home and so on and so forth, and presumably that activity could go on without it being publicised, let's say, and yet these women being driven to undertake these more active roles in propaganda. So I guess what I'm asking here is to comment on that tension, and also to look at how significant has the internet and social media been to the creation of these sorts of figures?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no way to overstate how important the internet has been to white nationalism. I think that America in particular, between the Civil War and the late 20th century, it became less politic, less diplomatic, less polite, less acceptable, less ethical to be as overtly white supremacist and racist as the country had always been. And so people started using more coded language and started talking about a post-racial society, which was a myth. And the internet appears, and people who want to speak more explicitly about matters of race and whiteness in particular, have a place where they can do that, away from the prying eyes of, I see that sounds pejorative, and I don't mean it that way, because I'm a prying eye. Like, I think prying eyes are really important, of the media or the legal system or any number of things. The internet was a boon, frankly, to white supremacists, and even in the early to mid 1980s, we're talking like the proto-internet, these dial-up message boards. White nationalists were some of the very first groups to get on that, frankly, because they saw that this was a way to communicate. And then as the internet exploded and as social media, as we now know it, exploded, it was another place where people who were feeling aggrieved, people who were feeling confused, people who were feeling left behind, whatever it may be, could go and they can frankly find any message they want to find, whether it's one of go commit violence and you'll be a warrior for the cause, or something not quite so extreme, but still in the same ecosystem of, well, here's how you can feel better about yourself and better about your place in the world. So truly, there is no way to overstate the importance of the internet. I think the thing that's important to remember, though, is that it's not that the internet gave rise to these beliefs. Again, I firmly believe that thinking of America as a white nation, thinking of white people as superior culturally, biologically, any number of things that white nationalists today talk about on the internet, that was all there long before. The internet just created a forum in which discussions about these things could go wild, frankly, and then also people could experiment with different ways of talking about it so that it seemed less objectionable to the mainstream. So truly cannot overstate the internet. I was actually talking to someone the other day who works in terms of service for a social media platform. So, taking things down when it's either hate speech or child pornography or any number of things. And I said, I truly don't know how you do your job. I would just delete the internet. Like, I would just be constantly, please, nope, can't do that. Can't say that, because it really can feel like a cesspool. Obviously, the internet does great things too. I'm talking to you in Australia over the internet. Like, that's amazing. But yeah, it's just the Wild West, frankly. And then in terms of the tension you're talking about, women as mothers versus influencers versus, people in power. I think that's it's a tension that women have navigated forever in white nationalism. And I think that they have to walk a tightrope where even when they are playing the role of propagandist, or in the Instagram age as an influencer, or whatever word you want to apply to it, they also have to make sure that they're inhabiting a certain acceptable idea of what it means to be a woman. So that is certainly being a wife and a mother, or at least aspiring to be a wife and a mother if you're younger. But then also just, looking a certain way, having sort of traditional aesthetics. And so, yes, they're propagandists. Yes, they are influencers, but they're also playing by a certain rule book, frankly. And I think that they are the best among them in terms of like the savviest among them have really figured out how to do that.
Just on the internet point, it was sort of quaint to read in the book about, someone going online and going to Stormfront and
I know
getting into that rather than just, going to YouTube and looking up, how do I make pickles? And then
right.
going down that recommendation algorithm rabbit hole.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's crazy. And, Stormfront's still there. I read a lot of Stormfront because of the research for the book. And I'm sure that the NSA and FBI are like, what is this woman in Brooklyn, New York doing? Reading a lot of Stormfront. But it is, it does feel antiquated because Stormfront is janky, for lack of a better word. It's clunky. It's just a 101 message board. And then you look at something YouTube, I think truly is the most toxic of these spaces where, you get on and I don't know, like let's say I don't know, I've been hearing in the news about, this Q community. What is this Q community? And you get on and you see what, is, a pretty decent explainer of just, what the Q conspiracy is all about. But then all of the recommendations, all of the where the algorithm takes you is to actual believers in that conspiracy. Or to your point, you go online to look up how to make pickles or any number of things, and suddenly you're like, why am I listening to people talk about neo-Nazis? And so it's quaint to imagine a time where if you logged onto the internet, you had to go specifically to the racist site you meant to go to. And that's, again, just another way in which you cannot overstate the importance of the internet, and it's just unbridled way of letting this kind of hate speech and disinformation flow.
Well, folks, we ran out of time for the radio show, but if you want to hear us ask a few more questions of Seyward, you can grab the podcast version of this show at 3cr.org.au/passaran. We are out of here. Global Intifada is up next. Here's Pussy Riot. Make America Great Again. See ya.
What do you want your world to look like? What do you want it to be? Do you know that the wall has two sides and nobody is free? Did your mama come from Mexico? Papa come from Palestine? Sneaking all through Syria, crossing all the borderlines. Let other people in. Listen to your women. Stop killing black children. Let other people in. Listen to your women. Stop killing black children. Make America great again. Could you imagine a politician calling a woman a dog? Do you wanna stay in the kitchen? Is that where you belong? How do you picture the perfect leader? How do you want him to be? Has he promoted the use of torture and killing families? Did your mama come from Mexico? Papa come from Palestine? Sneaking all through Syria, crossing all the borderlines. Let other people in. Listen to your women. Stop killing black children. Let other people in. Listen to your women. Stop killing black children. Make America great again. Your mama come from Mexico, Papa come from Palestine, sneaking all through Syria, crossing all the borderlines. Let other people in. Listen to your women. Stop killing black children. Make America great again. Let other people in. Listen to your women. Stop killing black children. Make America great again.
The Queen Victoria Women's Centre is calling all craftivists to join us and make a fuss. Make a Fuss is a crowdsourced craftivist project looking for submissions on the theme of women's silence. If you've experienced a time when you didn't want to make a fuss, why not get crafting and make some noise? For more information, go to qvwc.org.au and click on Make a Fuss. Submissions close August 19th. Queen Victoria Women's Centre is a 3CR supporter.